On the lyric feature this week, The Road to Maritana looks at the career and fortunes of opera composer William Vincent Wallace and visits his grave in London. Una Hunt presents the final programme in her three-part series celebrating the bicentenary of the composer's birth in Waterford.
Like a soldier fall upon some open plain, his breast expanding for the ball to blot out every stain. Brave manly hearts confirm my doom, what gentler ones may tell.
Welcome again to The Road to Maritana and the extraordinary adventures of William Vincent Wallace, composer of the once famous opera Maritana. And from the opera comes that rousing theatrical song, Let Me Like a Soldier Fall, sung there by Paul Charles Clarke. In the last programmes, we traced Wallace's road as a global traveller from Australia to South and North America, and his career as a double virtuoso on the piano and violin, not to mention his later success as a popular composer for the drawing room, especially in America. But I wonder how his odyssey around the world brought him to writing his first opera. Nothing for it but to talk to the experts, Pete Jaggard and David Grant, and to his recent biographer, Andrew Lamb.
He really wasn't inspired to consider himself a virtuoso, in my judgment, until he was able to enthuse audiences in Australia. He was then able to continue to do so when he travelled through South America. Now, at that stage, he can't have done a great deal of operatic work. Okay, in Dublin he would have accompanied operatic seasons, but there's no sign at all of him having wanted to compose operas by that stage. But in Mexico, certainly he was leader of the orchestra for an opera season. Again, even when he travelled on to New York, there's no suggestion of him wanting to compose an opera. I think it was when he reached London and he saw the success that Balfe had had with The Bohemian Girl at Drury Lane that he thought, well, what Balfe can do, I can do. If that's the way that you achieve success here, then I'll compose operas. And that's, to my mind, is how Maritana came about. I don't think there's any evidence at all that he had seriously considered operatic writing before he arrived in London. And of course, the type of opera that was put on at Drury Lane in London was essentially a popular type of opera. It was designed to draw the crowds in huge numbers, and of course it needed good tunes. It needed ballads that could be taken home and performed in the drawing room, and so it was not necessary really to be able to compose deep operatic works to succeed in London at that time. Even for operatic compositions, the money essentially came from the music publishers. It was the music publishers who paid for the big sums of money to be able to publish the music. It wasn't the theatre producers such as Alfred Bunn at Drury Lane who paid big sums of money. And of course this is that was the nature of the things there. Much the same way as nearer our own time, the record companies would pay large sums of money to be able to issue original cast recordings of musicals, for instance. So it was in the 1840s, 1850s that the music publishers were the ones who made the money and therefore could afford to sponsor the compositions. In Italy, of course, opera was a way of life, and there were opera houses up and down the country. There were opera houses around the world that would perform any Italian opera that came out, and individual arias would become popular in their own right. It wasn't the same in Britain. Opera never became a way of life in Britain at all, and really the only way that you could get an opera produced would be to make sure that it contained these ballads that could be detached and sung in the drawing room, generating obviously money for the music publishers who were the main sponsors of the compositions in the first place. So it was a very different type of situation in Britain from what there might have been in Italy in particular, and perhaps to a lesser extent in France or in Germany.
The English opera movement in the 1830s in London was started by a group of composers which included Balfe, also Edward Loder and John Barnett. And it was really because music was, and particularly opera music, was lagging behind. So they started writing operas in English. These were largely for the emerging middle class. So you really had sort of two forms of opera in London. You had music for the aristocracy, which was largely the Italian and French operas, and they were performed at Her Majesty's Theatre. And then you had these new operas, which were, first of all, in English, so they were obviously more easily understood. And then also, they had kind of simpler plots, and they were dialogue operas, so that what we now call opera by numbers. And so the publishers in London could actually print the music as sheet music. So a kind of a little industry kind of grew up. Now, when Wallace arrived in 1845, this movement was really very well underway. And in a sense, Maritana, while it is Wallace's first opera, as we know, it was kind of the end of that early period. And people often ask, why did he not write more operas like Maritana? Why did he kind of wander off into more serious opera? It was because things were getting more sophisticated. Audiences were expecting more sophisticated works. So I think Maritana is kind of unique in being the last of those kind of early Victorian operas of that style. The Bohemian Girl was 1843, and actually the Bohemian Girl may indirectly have been an influence on Maritana in the sense that Fitzball, he didn't write the libretto of the Bohemian Girl, of course, that was Alfred Bunn, but Fitzball was looking round for a play or whatever which involved a gypsy girl. And it just so happened that in 1844 in London there was this French play, Don César de Bazin, which has the gypsy girl Maritana. And Fitzball was clever enough, because the play had been on countless times in London the previous season, to call the opera Maritana rather than Don César, because he wanted to focus on the gypsy girl element of it, and obviously it was a major selling point. I think there was a kind of, you can imagine people who maybe a generation previously had lived in the country and had come into the big cities and the smoky cities and the overcrowding. It's hard not to think that it was almost like the legend of Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest, that there was this element that they could for a few hours go back into a kind of a more idyllic kind of a world, the world which wasn't kind of factory chimneys and all of that sort of thing. I suspect that was one of the reasons why these operas were so popular. There was an escapist element in them. But there was a long tradition of the gypsy in literature, if you like, and many of the plays and the operas of the mid-19th century, as we know, featured gypsies in one shape or another. I mean, from Verdi through to other composers. So it was a very popular theme at the time.
At the end of the season, the Italian opera closed down, so you'll get Alfred Bunn's Drury Lane season kicking off in October. Usually coincides with the start of the hunting season when the aristos are away. So you're talking about a different audience. You haven't got the very rich attending. It is middle class and beyond, and because there's no state subsidy, whereas the Italian opera could more or less hold itself up with subscriptions from the rich because they would just do it anyway. You've got people like Alfred Bunn at Drury Lane who are trying to maximise things. In order to make a profit, you've got to give the public what they want. Now, there are fads for things at different times. One moment it can be the drama, the next moment it can be the opera or musicals or what have you. So a good manager had to keep their eye on what the public were wanting, otherwise they'd have an empty theatre. Now, Alfred Bunn, and this is before the success of the Bohemian Girl, had realised that musical theatre was paying more than what was more called the legitimate theatre.
Sings the meadow bright
glorious and beautiful scenes that are brightest. It comes from Maritana and could perhaps be described as Wallace's signature melody. A lovely performance there from soprano Deborah Riedel. The Australian Opera and Ballet Orchestra was conducted by Richard Bonning. Now, Bonning has been a tireless promoter of Wallace's music over the years, not just in Australia, but all round the world. I caught up with the maestro on the phone from his home in Switzerland.
I think it's time now to open our eyes and have a look at some of the music of this period, the mid-19th century, because Wallace was very, very famous in his own day, and not only in Ireland, I mean, all over the world. He travelled. He had huge successes in North and South America, and in Australia, and in Europe, and he wrote music which was wonderful. Today, people think it's perhaps too accessible, too simple. Well, that's their problem. To me, he wrote very beautiful music. He had a wonderful melodic instinct. And he had a good feeling for the orchestra. He was a brilliant pianist, a brilliant violinist, and knew how to write for the instruments. Oh, I think it's time he was really taken very, very much more seriously than he has been. And there's some very beautiful songs. And he wrote, some of the songs are quite simple. Some of them are very ornate and very, very difficult. Because he wrote both for the for the home consumption, which was very important in those days when people sat at home and made music instead of going to the cinema and television, which didn't exist. And then he wrote for the major singers of the day. He played in the big. I mean, he dealt with the Paris Opera, with the Vienna State Opera, as well as the big theatres in London. We should not forget Wallace.
Maestro Richard Bonning, a key figure in promoting Wallace's music. Most importantly, Bonning has recorded excerpts from Wallace's operas on CD and conducted the recording of Lurline, which we'll hear later in the programme. With the success of Maritana in London, Wallace began to look further afield for opportunities to stage his opera, and it was transferred to Vienna, where it was produced in German. David Grant has spent many years assembling a critical edition based on the autograph score for the Viennese performances.
Well, what happened was, of course, Maritana was a great success in London, and we're not exactly sure of how Wallace got it put on in Vienna, but he got a set of performances in the Theater an der Wien in early 1848, and he took time to revise the opera musically as well for 1848, so that I regard the 1848 version of Maritana, even though it isn't the original version as such, as being possibly, the best version of Maritana that has come down to us. So this is why I was interested in doing a new edition. Now, we're very lucky that the man who did the translation into German for Vienna, who was Alfred Julius Becher, was he was born in England, actually, so he had English. So his German, actually, he kept it very, very close to the original English script. And it meant that my edition is actually bilingual, in the sense that I've retained all of the familiar English lyrics and so on, and the dialogues. But we're lucky as well that the extra pieces that Wallace wrote for Vienna, that in his own hand, into the autograph score you mentioned, he's written the lyrics in English, so that there were only a very few passages where I had to do translations of Becher's German into English, so that we have all that wonderful extra music. It's only 2 or 3 numbers, but it actually makes a huge difference to the completion of the opera, to how it finishes and so on. It was very popular with the public, but it wasn't at all popular with the critics. And of course the critics were very much of the establishment, and the criticisms from the Viennese papers are actually very vitriolic and they're saying, you know, why are these English composers coming over here, taking the bread out of the mouths of German composers, you know? So they weren't and they weren't very complimentary about the music. They were saying that Maritana was kind of, you know, warmed up Donizetti and all these kind of phrases. But there's a very interesting letter by a Austrian professor of music who was resident in Vienna, Josef Fischoff was his name, and he wrote to the English papers and said, you know, it took a while for Maritana kind of to get going at the Theatre an der Wien. He said the early performances weren't great because the music was a bit strange to them and so on. But he said by the end, he said that there wasn't a seat to be had. And it actually ran up to the end of February. So it ran for 2 months. And, you know, it was a repertory theatre, the Theatre an der Wien. So they actually moved on to other repertoire after that. And of course, the revolution happened in March of 1848, so that put paid to a lot of things as well.
And what happened to the poor translator, librettist?
Well, it's absolutely extraordinary that this man, Alfred Julius Becher, was apparently very quiet, unassuming man in his everyday kind of demeanour, but politically he was a radical. So when the revolution broke out in March 1848, he became one of the ringleaders of it. And when the city was eventually taken over by the Austrian troops again, a General Windischgrätz was his name, he went into hiding, but in some way he was captured and he was court-martialed and he was executed by a firing squad in Vienna in November of 1848. Now that had a devastating effect on Wallace's hopes. He had actually left Vienna before the revolution in February to go back to London. He had business that he had to look after there, and he had hoped to come back. In fact, the reason why we have Maritana in this pristine Viennese version is that he left the score in Vienna for it to be copied because he had plans to put it on in the State Opera. And when I went to Vienna to the archives there, all of the music for Maritana is actually in the opera archive of the State Opera, even though it was never actually performed there. So they had plans to perform it there. And we know that, for example, the Bohemian Girl was put on in the State Opera in Vienna for about 25 years. It was one of the most popular operas in Vienna, in a German translation now. And I'm sure Wallace's Maritana would have been the same, you know. So Becher, while he did Wallace obviously great service in terms of the translation and so on, his political career rather put paid to Wallace's hopes in Vienna. Wallace was afraid to go back there, and the score remained there until I discovered it, you know.
Well, maybe that's just as well. At least it's still there.
Well, this is it, and I mean, we would have lost all of that music really if it hadn't been for those particular circumstances, which is an extraordinary set of circumstances, really.
Despite Wallace's achievements, not to mention Richard Bonning's belief in the value of Wallace's music, English opera was clearly a precarious business in the mid-19th century. Yet the name of one enterprising individual seems to stand out: Alfred Bunn, who, as chance would have it, was in Dublin in Wallace's early years. David takes up the story.
Bunn had been stage manager in Drury Lane in London, and I suppose he was advancing his own career, and he came to Dublin as the manager of the Theatre Royal. Now, he wasn't, I think, in place for that very long. I mean, we're used now in our day to theatres being open all the time, but I think in those days, you know, a theatre might have had a season and then it might have closed for a few months and so on. But whether Bunn actually, it's an interesting question whether Bunn actually remembered the young Wallace years later when he met him in London is a moot point. But certainly he was a very exceptional person and he probably did. But it was Bunn who was instrumental in Wallace starting his career as an opera composer, in the sense that Bunn was by then manager of Drury Lane and put on Maritana, and also commissioned Wallace's second opera, for which Bunn wrote the libretto. And this is not so well known, the second opera called Matilda. But it was indirectly as a result of that second opera that Bunn became bankrupt, because there was so much expense for staging this grand opera Matilda that, you know, he eventually became bankrupt. Bunn has to be congratulated on a number of fronts. I think he was, as they say now in modern parlance, he was prepared to put his money where his mouth is. I mean, he literally expended everything he had on this opera by Wallace, and it's not surprising that he went bankrupt shortly after that. So a very, very important figure. And of course, Bunn wrote a very interesting book called The Stage. It's called The Stage for short. I can't remember its full title now. It's in several volumes, where he goes into his own theories about what a theatre should be about and so on. And of course, he wasn't very much liked in London in Drury Lane, because Drury Lane had been the theatre for Shakespeare. And here was Bunn putting on ballets and circuses and things like that. So it's no wonder that he kind of got lampooned a bit by the establishment.
Of course, Wallace wasn't the only opera composer from Ireland in the 19th century to be supported by Alfred Bunn. There was also his contemporary, Michael William Balfe, composer of the famous Bohemian Girl. And it's interesting to note that Alfred Bunn wrote the libretto for Balfe's opera. I thought Balfe's biographer, Basil Walsh, might have something to add on the subject of Bunn's versification.
Both Fitzball and Alfred Bunn were the two primary librettists that they used, both of them used, and both of them were known as hack poets at the time. And in the case of Bunn, the problem with Bunn was he controlled the theatres, the Drury Lane Theatre, he controlled the Princess Theatre, I believe, and also Covent Garden at one point in time. And because of that, so if you wanted to get your opera performed, you basically had to use his words, his libretto, in order to produce it. So that was kind of the penalty you paid. I don't think there was a problem so much at the period with the verbiage that they used, but there was certainly, as time went on, it became very dated and very, just not functional in terms of the vocal scene in anywhere in the English-speaking world, and there were many changes made to some of Balfe's works, I know, over time, but they would really need to be modernized to some degree anyway, without losing the storyline or that type of thing, and I think that would be necessary to before you could really mount any of those English operas today.
Well, Bunn is kind of notorious as a librettist. I mean, his versification is supposed to be among the worst in history, you know. But, I mean, his heart was in the right place. And, I mean, in fairness, he did write the lyrics for two of the most famous numbers in Maritana, which are In Happy Moments and Scenes That Are Brightest. So, you know, that's very much to his credit, even though some of the other material that he wrote is, frankly, it's not great. But in the early years, I mean, the emphasis was very much on melody, and I don't think people worried too much about the words. I mean, there's a famous story told about Balfe where he was conducting one of his operas in London with the tenor Sims Reeves, the famous tenor. And I think it was actually the Bohemian Girl they were doing. And Reeves had actually taken the trouble to study the lyrics, and some of them were very awkward, and he changed things around a bit. And Balfe is supposed to have said to him afterwards, "What were you at tonight, Jack? You know, you were changing all the words around." And Reeves was saying, "Well, I was trying to make sense of them, you know." And Balfe said, "Well, I prefer them as they are, you know."
Well, Maritana is the only one of Wallace's operas that's known at all now. But there were several others, so I wonder what happened to them.
Well, what happened was that there was a complete change of style between the writing of Maritana and the next opera, which came only a year later. And I think there are no sort of hard and fast theories about this, but just my own opinion about this would be that, again, the opera scene was changing. There were 3 theatres in London which were at loggerheads in terms of attracting audiences. There was Covent Garden, there was Her Majesty's, which was the home of serious Italian and French opera, and there was Bunn at Drury Lane. And Bunn commissioned Wallace's second opera, which was Matilda. It's on a rather obscure story set in Bohemia in the mid-15th century about a Queen Matilda whose husband, the king, has gone lost in the wars with the Turks. But apparently it's a very fine work, but unfortunately the music is lost. All we have is a vocal score, and of course it's very difficult to reconstruct an opera just from a vocal score. I don't think it was ever produced or performed again after its initial production in Drury Lane in 1847. Now, when Wallace was in Vienna in 1847 preparing for Maritana, which was at the very beginning of 1848, he was already at work on his third opera, which was Lurline or Lurline. And that is a complete change of style in that it's very much in the style of Weber and the German composers. And maybe it's the fact that Wallace had or was in Vienna when he was writing it, that he already had his eye on perhaps German-speaking opera houses. We don't know. But it's a very beautiful opera, I think, Lurline. I mean, the stretches of music in it are quite magnificent, I think.
Lurline is the German Lorelei story, a folk legend actually, of the River Rhine, where a siren lures fishermen to their deaths by her entrancing harp playing. She falls in love with Count Rupert, who does not drown but is taken to her father, the King of the Rhine, King Rheinberg, who lives under the waves in coral caves. Rupert is allowed to return to his castle later, however, where things start to go wrong, and a ring that Lurline gave him to wear for protection is thrown into the Rhine by a jealous hussy. This is a contralto part, Giva, who adds just a touch of comedy to the whole opera. Anyway, happiness is in the end restored, as is usual in any British opera, and of course your listeners will understand that it's not so far from Wagner's Ring, and the Lorelei theme is very much in force there. And interestingly, at the same time that Wallace was writing this, which was 1847, there was Mendelssohn putting his Lorelei together. So this was a storyline which was very, very popular at that point in time. Surprisingly, although it was written in 1847 and finished July 1848, it was put on the shelf for over 10 years. The reason for this was that the London theatre managers were in the doldrums, many went bankrupt. Wallace thought that he'd go back to America and make some money there, presumably, and so he was away from Britain for quite a while, and so Lurline just sat on a shelf until the Pine Harrison Group Opera Company, who took over Covent Garden for winter seasons, decided that they would encourage British composers, and he offered Lurline to them, and they thought it was very good and took it and put it on in February 1860. And it played all year up to November. In November it might still have gone on had they not had to make way for a new opera by Balfe. And as with Maritana, there are hints, of Wagner's dark horns and soaring strings. To me, that's a hallmark of Wagner. But they're here in Wallace. We have, as in the introduction to Lurline, the scene of the Rhine superbly set. He has rippling strings, which reminds us of Smetna's Moldo, and you can hear the river rambling along its way down to the sea. And it's just an absolute joy. And of course, I'm only speaking about Lurleen because that's the only one I really know so well.
All is silent, save the murmur of the lone wave, and the nightingale who in sadness to the moonbeam telleth her lovelorn tale. In yonder blue serene, the stars above, the sentinel, the stars above hold sentinel. From the crystal deep, the weedy fisherman to his home is gone, and sings with nature into tranquil sleep, into tranquil sleep, into tranquil sleep.
David Soar as Rheinberg, the River King, in Wallace's opera Lurleen. That CD recording of the opera, conducted by Richard Bonning, comes from Victorian Opera Northwest in the UK. But we have still to hear Wallace's largest opera, The Amber Witch, probably the most ambitious in the English language of the mid-19th century. The problems with staging or recording these operas nowadays are monumental. The orchestral parts are often missing, or worse still, the autograph score. The amount of work and the expense in bringing them back to the stage is enough to deter all, except perhaps the truly dedicated. Of course, Basil Walsh and David Grant have thought deeply about why the operas of Balfe and Wallace have fallen out of favour, and indeed how they might be revived. But there are no easy solutions.
Well, I mean, it's not just their operas. In the 19th century, there were probably close to, if you take Italian composers and French composers, who were the primary composers of the period, there were probably somewhere around about 1,500 or more operas composed. And as an example, Aubert wrote something like 60, 70 operas. Mercadante wrote 60 operas, 70 operas in Italy.
And these were seriously
and
famous
these
people.
are major composers at the time. And all of these, they all dropped off the charts. And they dropped off the charts really because two things happened in the mid-19th century. One was the advent of Verdi in 1842 in Milan, when Nabucco was performed with great success, and immediately afterwards, a year later in Milan, I Lombardi, and then 1843 there was I Lombardi, and then 1844 was Hernani. So Verdi sort of began to dominate the marketplace, so to speak, in Europe. And next to him then Wagner wrote his first great operatic success in 1842, which was Rienzi for Dresden, I believe, and then a year later the Flying Dutchman, De Vliegelende Hollander, and so those two dominated the second half of the 19th century. And if you look at the records of Covent Garden or the Metropolitan Opera or any of the major opera houses, you'll see that the only two bel canto operas that actually, or a little more, maybe 4 bel canto operas that survived. I mean, there were Donizetti's great works like Anna Bolena and Maria Tudor and Maria Stuarda and other operas of that nature just didn't survive. Lucia de Lammermoor did, and the Barber of Seville did, Norma did, and La Sonnambula did. But Verdi and Wagner dominated the scene, and Balfe and Wallace's works more or less got pushed aside, similar, with the exception of Maritana and the Bohemian Girl. And I mean, if you look what we did for Balfe's bicentennial celebration in Dublin, I say celebration with a question mark really, because there was really no major effort by anybody in Ireland in relation to that except Opera Ireland at the time. And we did Balfe's Falstaff, which was actually an opera that was written, it was an Italian libretto for the Italian Opera in London. And that was highly successful in its day in 1838, but we performed it for the first time since 1838, and it was broadcast over the EU broadcast system, and it was also recorded, and it has done extremely well on Amazon in terms of the CD sales. And the reviews of it also by Opera News in New York, the publication of the Metropolitan Opera, was very, very good. It talked about it being a great bel canto opera, and certainly something that anybody who was interested in that period of opera and that period of time should definitely get a copy of it. There's enough between the two of them in their operas and their songs to certainly create a festival. So the music is available. The British Library has an incredible amount of Balfe scores, particularly, and also a number of Wallace scores, and so there's plenty of material available for a festival in terms of music of both of those composers. You know, the question is, you'd have to update some of the English libretto versions, and then of course the whole question of funding is the key issue to any of this at any point in time these days.
It's the classic chicken and egg situation, you know, that you have to have all of the music available before anybody will look at it and consider producing it. But then on the other hand, for somebody to go and prepare all of the music and the score and all of that without the possibility of a production, nobody is going to do that. I mean, I've done it for Maritana, but that's different because it's a very popular work and I'm sure it's going to be performed eventually. But for some works like The Desert Flower and works like that, I mean, you would have to have some kind of a system whereby scores were produced and parts were produced. And as you know, it's a huge labour, even with modern computers and all the paraphernalia, digital paraphernalia, still a very big job to undertake. And of course, I spent almost 10 years working on Maritana, but at least half of that time was actually finding all the materials and getting them all together and making yourself familiar with them and all of this, because you can't edit something if you're not familiar with it, you know. It's not a purely mechanical exercise. So it's a huge labour. But I honestly believe that unless a start is made in some systematic way of doing this for the Irish opera composers, the Anglo-Irish opera composers, such as Balfe and Wallace, that the works are just not going to be performed because the difficulties are just so great, you know. I did say earlier, and I think it's true, that the Anglo-Irish composers, if we may call them that, fall between two stools, because the British establishment sort of regard them as Irish, and the Irish establishment don't regard them as being sort of native Irish, if you like, even though they were all native Irish, Balfe and Wallace, but that they kind of expecting somebody else to take responsibility for them, you know. I don't know what it is about our makeup. I mean, we really value our writers, people like Yeats and Joyce and people like that, but when it comes to the composers, we seem to sort of not have the same regard for them, even though they were kind of famous all over Europe and, in Wallace's case, actually all over the world. And it's a shame because the music is lovely and it's really deserving of being preserved, because if you take a work like Maritana, I mean, it was on the stage for 100 years. Now, you don't get that kind of popularity without the music being worth something, I think. Well, I think what we need actually is some kind of an archive, a central archive of their music. For example, Wallace, because he travelled so much, his music is spread all over the place. There are some scores in America, there's Maritana in Vienna, and some of the pieces are in London. So we need to get all of the music in one place, particularly the opera music, if we're going to ever do anything about it. And then we need some kind of a scheme. I mean, it can't be left to single individuals, such as myself, for example, to produce opera editions. I mean, it's a huge labour and it's very intensive in terms of time and also in terms of expense. So there needs to be some scheme set up. I mean, for example, I was reading recently of schemes to digitise collections, for example, in various Irish universities and so on. So, I mean, why not digitise Wallace and Balfe's music? There's plenty of it there for that purpose, because that's what's needed now, because as you know, the means by which operas are produced now, the music is produced, is you digitize the score first of all using a music program, and then you produce a whole new set of parts from that. Now that's something that could be done, for example, by postgraduate students, under proper supervision. So unless I think something like that is put in place, I'm afraid we may be here, or others may be here in years to come at other anniversaries asking the same question,
The Night Winds from the opera Lurline by William Vincent Wallace, that recording again from soprano Deborah Riedel. Wallace died at the relatively young age of 53 in Chateau de Bagan in the south of France. His body was embalmed and transported to London, where he is buried in Kensal Green Cemetery. A few years ago, the stone on his grave was replaced. So on a recent visit to London, I asked trustee of the cemetery and chief guide Henry Vivian Neal to show me the grave.
It's a recent headstone. There was originally a marble ledger to William Vincent Wallace that had become very, very worn over time, and the lead lettering, which was sunk into the marble, over time becomes proud of the marble and eventually is very, very vulnerable, and that is now completely illegible. So what has been done subsequently is a large headstone has been erected to William Vincent Wallace, and I think that was put up in the last 2 or 3 years. I can't remember the exact date, but fairly recently. And as you see, it commemorates William Vincent Wallace, and it reads composer. It gives his dates of birth and death, 1812 in Waterford, and died in the Pyrenees in France in 1865. And it records 6 operas, including Maritana and Lurline, given their premieres in 1845 and 1860. And it also goes on to record that he was a piano and violin virtuoso, founder of the Australian Music Festival in Sydney, founder member of the New York Philharmonic Society, and an adventurous world traveller. And I love headstones like this, even modern ones, because actually it tells us lots about the individual himself. Unlike something that just says, dearly beloved mother, and nothing more than that. And there's also rather a nice quotation at the end. It's great, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. Music is an art that knows no locality but heaven. And that's by William Wallace himself. So I think it's rather good, yes. He's in very good company in this area. To the immediate right is a monument to a sculptor in ordinary to Queen Victoria, William Behnes, or Beans, not sure how it's pronounced, Behnes. And to the left, the monument to a cemetery pioneer, John Claudius Loudon, who wrote widely on cemeteries. We're on the circle, which is, if you like, the Campo Santo in the centre of the cemetery, and there are all sorts of people in this area here. So eminent people in lots of different fields of activity.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I've just glimpsed behind Balfe, the composer.
Yes, he has a rather fine small Peterhead granite obelisk commemorating, as it says, Balfe the composer. Doesn't give so much biographical detail, it just gives his dates and mentions his wife as well. But I rather like the elegance of the Peterhead granite obelisk. It's simple, it makes a very sort of clear statement, and granite also lasts incredibly well in the English environment, unlike Wallace's, as I said, ledger, which had become very worn. The lettering on Balfe's monument is still as clear and legible as it was on the day it was cut.
Henry Vivian Neale at Wallace's grave in Kensal Green Cemetery in London, the final leg of the journey on my road to Maritana. If you're planning a trip down under to Australia, or a hike across the Andes, spare a thought for William Vincent Wallace, surely Ireland's most fascinating virtuoso and composer, who was there before all the rest. I suspect, though, that David Grant's journey has only just begun. One burning question remains: what was Wallace really like?
It seems to me from my own reading that he was a bit of he was a bit of a mix of a character. For example, Berlioz has a wonderful description of him in one of his books where he says he was a total eccentric, Wallace. He said on the one hand he was kind of very phlegmatic, like an Englishman, but on the other hand he says he was rash and violent, in inverted commas, like an American. So that he must have been a bit of both of those, because apparently all the accounts of him in society was that he was a very quiet, unassuming kind of a man. But yet there is this adventurer that went all around the world, and that not only did that but survived it and lived to tell the tale, literally, you know.
And some amazing tales at that.
And some amazing stories. So he must have been quite a mix as a character. But there is one thing that is no doubt about: he was really very well loved as a person, not just by his immediate family, obviously, but by all his acquaintances. And there are some lovely obituaries in the papers at the time of his death where they talk about, you know, his kindness and his concern for people. And he seems to have been a very nice man, actually, on a personal level. You know, a person I'd love to meet.
The Road to Maritana was presented and produced by Una Hunt. Contributors in this week's programme included maestro and promoter of Wallace's music, Richard Bonning, Dr. David Grant and Peter Jagger, two of the leading authorities on the composer, Wallace's biographer, Andrew Lamb, Irish music and opera expert, Basil Walsh, trustee of the Friends of Kensal Green Cemetery and chief guide, Henry Vivian Neal, and Raymond Walker, director and chairman of Victorian Opera Northwest. The Road to Maritana is a heritage music production for RTE Lyric FM and is made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland's Sound and Vision Broadcasting Funding Scheme. Next Friday on the Lyric feature, Making Music Together, the first episode in a new 4-part documentary series exploring the role music plays in human relationships at an interpersonal and social level. For more information or to listen to our archived programmes, visit the Lyric feature page of the Lyric website, where you'll also find contact details for the programme. Next up tonight here on Lyric, it's time for the Friday concert.
The young Armenian pianist Tigran Hamazian has been making big waves in the jazz world. With his dynamic mix of jazz and lyrical Armenian folk songs, he's been touted the next Keith Jarrett. In advance of his upcoming Irish dates, join us nightly this week on The Blue of the Night as we turn the spotlight on Tigran. Nightly